So, very pleased to be here to meet some people that I know. I come from Barcelona, Spain. I am an interventional neurologist. And I'm going to explain here today some interesting concept that looks very promising in endovascular treatment. For those who are not doing thrombectomies, you may think that it's too specific, but stay tuned because it's a cool technology and interesting. So what I'm showing here are videos from our lab, and they may not express what strictly happens in patients, but certainly it's an approach. The slide shows the results over the years that we achieve with thrombectomy, and you can see how the blue, the dark and lighter blue, what we call perfect recanalization, TK2C and 3, are increasing and increasing over the years. We are becoming better. We have better tools. We still have way to improve in order to completely recanalize all our patients. Now, in order to do that, we use larger and larger catheters that will ingest the clots without fragmentation, and still the largest catheters that we are able to navigate to the ICA. Basically, they cover up to, in the largest case, up to 3/4 of the surface. So the clot is usually bigger, no, always bigger than the catheter from which we are going to aspirate, and that creates some kind of interaction and fragmentation that might be a problem. So these catheters, they can even arrest the flow because they are as big as in the outer diameter, they are as big as the artery, and they can arrest the flow, as you can see here. So we don't need these balloons that we used to arrest the flow, because by themselves the catheter can arrest the flow. Now I will skip this one, but what happens when we aspirate with a large catheter in the MCA is that we don't see that, but we might collapse the artery. And in this case, in which the artery had an implanted flow diverter and grow a clot there, and they aspirated. Look what happens when you aspirate from here. You're collapsing the artery here. And then we went to chase the clot with the aspiration catheter all the way, and when we aspirate here, the stent is collapsing and the artery is in fact collapsing, right? Usually we don't see that because there's no stent. But in a rabbit model, when we put a catheter inside and we start aspirating, this is what happens. We can collapse the clot. And this is very important because if we do pulses for aspirations, this is what happens, right? You can see here, we just aspirate the arterial wall and we don't aspirate the clot. And this is why we say that when we do contact aspiration, it's very important to navigate your catheter all the way to the clot. If the clot is a few millimeters away, you will not interact with the clot, and you're gonna do nothing. So you need to kiss the clot and then start aspirating, right? But many times, this is what happens. It's difficult to locate the exact occlusion location. Here's the occlusion location. It's very clear in this model. But now, when we did an angiogram, all this dead space is not filled with contrast. And we may think that the clot is here. In fact, it's a few millimeters away. So if we come with our aspirating catheter and we aspirate here, we're aspirating nothing, and we're not going to be successful. So I'm telling all this because then I can show this nice video. We created this very collapsible vessel-like, and it just collapsed when we aspirate. We come back to our models. When we do static aspiration, this is what happens. You see here, if we place a stent retriever inside the model, it will scaffold, it will have a radial force, and it avoids, to some extent, the collapse. And this is what happens with the flow. The flow is very slow when we aspirate. It's much faster because our catheter keeps the artery open. Now, let's move forward. If we have a clot and we aspirate from a few millimeters away, nothing happens, as you can see here. If you have a stent retriever, yes, despite that there's going to be collapse, you pull your stent retriever and you overcome this collapse and you finally ingest your clot. As you can see here, this is what we are doing when we do thrombectomies. Now, another concept that I want to share with you is this following. When you do only aspiration, you are not controlling the full length of the clot. Sometimes the tail can go away. And then many times we remain like this and we wait. You need to wait. And very often, finally, the negative pressure overcomes and it brings the clot out. Not always. Sometimes the clot is too hard. The negative pressure is not enough. And when you pull your catheter, you're going to lose again the clot. So, my colleague Leonard from Singapore contacted me because he was doing a thrombectomy case with an aspiration pump and nothing was coming out. He decided to hook an additional syringe, and when he hooked the additional syringe, the clot came out. And he told me, what do you think happened? Is it because we increased the negative pressure? We did some experiments in our lab. The pumps usually take a few seconds until you reach the maximum negative pressure, and then you hook an additional syringe, and you create this little notch here. And this little notch, we believe that was enough. I don't think it's because you increase much the negative pressure. It's because of shaking. You shaked a little bit here, the clot, and it was absorbed, right? So let's go back to our lab. We have your curve here, and then you create this little notch. And because of this little notch, that would be, in some cases, sufficient to aspirate or ingest the clot, right? So this concept in physics is known as material fatigue, and it's what makes materials to degrade over time with vibrations, like your brand new car, or engines from airplanes, or sometimes even these disasters, because over the years you have vibrations, the material at the end fails and collapses, right? So we try to do that with the clot, the same concept. We apply these vibrations somehow with oscillating pressures, and you finally ingest the clot. So this is what you want to do. You want to apply a stress, and this stress has to be, every material in the world has these curves, and we all, at some point in our lives, try to break some metal, for example, and you know that the higher is the range, the more we bend, the less some number of cycles we need to cut the wire. If you do very little bending, you need many cycles, and if you do even smaller bendings, you will never be able to cut the wire. So with the clot, the same happens. We want the higher range, and with less cycles, we'll be able to ingest the clot. And we're going to try to do that by changing the pressure waves at the tip of our catheter. So this is the curve of pressures that we want to achieve at the tip of our catheter. If we just apply a negative constant pressure, this is what happens, and we can stay here forever, and the clot will never be ingested. Now, if we include in the system what we call a solenoid valve, basically it's a valve that opens and closes, and we program it. So if we do it 1 hertz at 1 cycle per second, the negative pressure will come, then you open and it slowly comes down, and the next second again, you start aspirating, and you have these cycles with this relative small range, right? If you do that faster, what happens is you will start here again, and your range is going to be smaller, right? So at high frequency, if you only have this setup, you're not going to be effective. This is what says here. You go, the higher the frequency, the flatter is the curve, right? So how do we overcome this? Also, if there is air in the system, it will be like a buffer, and you're not going to transmit to the tip of your catheter the waveforms. So how can we achieve higher range? We get rid of the air. To get rid of the air from cavitation, you just put a saline here, and you start aspirating and opening and closing. You increase your range, but now you decrease your maximum negative pressure, because now you're aspirating from both ends, right? So next step we did in the lab, we added a second solenoid valve that is inversely synchronized. When this is aspirating, this is closed. When this is closed, this is infusing. And then you get again a higher range with more negative pressures, which is good, but you want this range higher, bigger, right? You want this range bigger. This you achieve by actively pushing saline when this one is open. You pressurize the saline bag, and now the pressure comes down very fast because you're pressurizing here. And you get this nice range. However, this is what happens. Here we have negative constant pressure, and we start pressurizing with every cycle. Oops. And once you get below zero, at one point, if you pressurize too much, you can lose the clot again. Okay? The best is coming now. The best. So ideally, you marginally need to just to get to zero and then back to negative. So this will shake the clot as much as possible. And this you cannot do by hand. If you do that by hand, like in this case, if you try to do that by hand, you are not specific enough. And at some points, yes, you are only doing static aspiration, your clot comes all the way here, but then you start doing this maneuver fast, but look what happens. You eject at some points because you get above zero. Here you're going to have another one. Here, oops, you eject, and it can be dangerous. So you need to be very precise. The waveforms will depend on the resistance of your catheter, so your pump has to be set up according to your catheters, to the compliance. If the tubing is not compliant or is compliant, you need non-compliant tubes to get higher range. And then, look how beautiful. You start your cycles, and this is what I showed before, but if you really optimize this and you go very fast, have a close look here. Now we start, and in a few seconds the clot disappears. And this is very promising. I will play it again because it's really impressive. Like, you can eat progressively the clot in a second, but bit by bit. And if the clot is not fragmentable, what will happen is that with the cycles, you progressively going to shove inside the clot, as you can see here, and you wait, and with each cycle it goes inside, and finally you ingest the whole clot. So very promising. And not only this, with static you take out a lot of volume, so you create collapse. If there is cyclic, the volume that you aspirate is very low. You are not collapsing the vessel, and it's easier to navigate towards the clot. Here again, with static aspiration, what happens? Nothing happens. With cyclic, each cycle, you do not collapse, and the clot nicely comes out. So you don't need to be exactly precisely kissing the clot. So all this is nicely explained in this paper that our fellow just published. You can play with the cycles to increase the efficacy. And we started already a trial with a company that is manufacturing a similar device, Rapid Pulse. We started enrolling patients in this promising study in which basically, you hook your catheter to this device that creates these pulses and will aspirate the clot, hopefully without fragmentation and within one pass. I think there are a couple of examples here, but I mean, maybe it's very specific here, but it's a nice technology that we might hear coming. I'm sure you heard about stent retrievers, you heard about aspiration catheters, and probably in the next year we're going to hear about cyclic aspiration as a novel technology that can help us in the angio suite. So thank you very much.
Thank you.